Establishment leftist so-called journalists and celebrities are apoplectic over the fact that the owners of the Washington Post and the LA Times withheld presidential endorsements. The motivation for the newspaper neutrality, well, that might be elusive. But what the reactions reveal suggests that we've been wise to avoid those media outlets and writers as sources of trustworthy news. Instead, the petulant personalities seem more like ambulatory lessons about what it's like to live by lies. It's a laughable flash of petulance that some Americans might see as relatively insignificant given the nearly non-existent circulation of dinosaur news outlets and the increasing distrust shown by news consumers who encounter such fossils. But it actually opens a window on something the Media Research Center long has been fighting. On Friday, Washington Post Editor-at-Large Robert Kagan, the husband of ever-charming former diplomat and Ukraine-meddler Victoria Nuland, resigned from his royal post at the Washington Post, expressing in apocalyptic terms his anger over the fact that WaPo owner Jeff Bezos elected to not have the paper endorse any presidential candidate this time round. As Isaac Shore wrote for Mediaite, quote, Washington Post Editor-at-Large Robert Kagan resigned on Friday over the newspaper's decision not to endorse Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris, end quote. That's right. It wasn't the idea of remaining neutral, something that, according to reports, came from Bezos and something that many people might applaud. It was the fact that Bezos' position prevented the Washington Post from endorsing Kagan's favorite free speech hater, Harris. Curiously, Benzinga's Bibu Patnaik, assisted by AI as acknowledged at the bottom of Patnaik's piece, claims that this move runs counter to the Washington Post's so-called tradition. Yet, when announcing the decision Friday, WaPo publisher and CEO William Lewis reminded readers that the paper remained neutral in both the 1960 and 1972 presidential contests. One wonders then if it was Bibu Patnaik or the artificial intelligence or both that weren't interested in Lewis's valid historical points. And one might speculate as to whether Lewis and Bezos took this position in order to give their left-biased reporters, so-called, some cover, allowing the bigwigs and supporters of the leftist rag to claim, look, just look at the editorial board and overall position of the paper. Why, by golly, they're neutral. Yeah, it's definitely laughable. And yes, it has been exposed as laughable over and over again by the Media Research Center. In fact, a non-Bezos paper, the New York Post, which actually had the courage to publish the facts about the Hunter Biden laptop when Pop Media was falsely claiming it had no chain of custody and was part of a Russian psyop against Biden, recently cited the Media Research Center study indicating that such notoriously leftist publications as the Washington Post, Politico, and the New York Times favored Harris in their so-called journalism. But regardless of one's suspicions about Bezos' motivations for this return to neutrality, the Kagan explosion and expostulations offer some profound lessons in hypocrisy. Mediaite's Shore writes, quote, in November 2023, he, Kagan, published an expansive column in the Post under the headline, A Trump Dictatorship is Increasingly Inevitable. We should stop pretending, end quote. So Mr. Kagan, who evidently supports Harris, thinks that only Trump represents a titanic threat to the limitations to central government power that are outlined in the U.S. Constitution? Mr. Kagan focuses solely on Trump as a threat? Harris worked for a man who instituted border blocks for truckers who didn't conform to his unconstitutional federal mRNA jab diktat. She worked for a man who was vice president when Barack Obama tried to use the Espionage Act against more whistleblowers and journalists than all previous U.S. presidents combined, going back to the origin of the statute in World War I. Yet Kagan focuses only on Trump and does so with the myopia of a hardcore collectivist who seems to think that gang rule over individuals is both beneficial and the governing framework for the U.S. envisioned by the founders. Yes, folks, it's time to trot out the tired leftist fantasy called the democracy canard. Quote, "If Trump does win the election, he will immediately become the most powerful person ever to hold that office," wrote Kagan at the time, lamenting that we continue to drift toward dictatorship, still hoping for some intervention that will allow us to escape the consequences of our collective cowardice, our complacent, willful ignorance, and above all, our lack of any deep commitment to liberal democracy. End quote. It's so childish as to be nearly insufferable. In covering Kagan's latest petulant explosion and those of other journalists and left-loving political hacks, journalist Glenn Greenwald put it well, saying,
"Where would this idea come from that it's somehow courageous to endorse Kamala Harris and cowardly not to?" And yes, newspapers are supposed to hold the powerful to account. Right now, the powerful are the people occupying the White House. That's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And what they're angry about isn't the Washington Post's failure to hold Kamala Harris to account. They're angry at the Washington Post's refusal to cheerlead for Kamala Harris openly, explicitly in this election, because that is what their actual expectation of media outlets is, not to inform the world, not to do reporting, not to hold powerful people accountable, but to do everything possible to help the Democratic Party win.
And while the WaPo whiners like Kagan rage supreme, and by the way, even author Stephen King announced that he was canceling his 5-year-long subscription to the paper, inspiring many to wonder how he could waste that cash for so long, and inspiring others to ask if he'll be consistent and push to have his books removed from Bezos' Amazon. Well, the weekend also saw Defections from the Los Angeles Times, where subsequent to Friday's announcement by owner Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong that the paper wouldn't endorse a candidate for the first time since 2008, 3 members of that board resigned. And many journalists in leftist circles seem completely comfortable backing Harris, despite her dark and unconstitutional track record. Thus, the coast-to-coast uproar over neutrality tells media watchdogs a great deal and lends credence to the idea that it's wise to hold many of the dinosaur so-called journalists in contempt and watch for their absolutely shameful hypocrisy. As independent reporters write and stream about important events and the threats to liberty that are out there, we can find the trustworthy figures and disregard the unscrupulous. And given how poorly the dinosaur outlets like Kagan's old Washington Post are performing, it seems that trend certainly has begun. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please like and subscribe. Spread the videos far and wide. Of course, follow us on Rumble, where they don't censor us. They do censor us at YouTube. We're still at YouTube. Please double check that you're subscribed there. Find us all the time at MRC-TV.org. That's MRC-TV.org. You'll see what the whole team is doing. Open up a new tab and please visit the MRC TV store and consider donating to the Media Research Center. You can also find us inside Facebook, on TikTok, and on Instagram. If you want to follow me on Gab, I'm at Gardner Goldsmith, and on X, I'm at Gard Goldsmith. And of course, we hope that you'll follow the Media Research Center on X as well. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please share the videos. For MRC TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.